It's been 2 weeks since the terror attacks in Israel horrified and shocked us in their depravity. 2 weeks since the world we thought we knew in the 21st century of inclusiveness and equality was shaken, and it feels like it'll never be the same again. There are the immediate tragic victims of the terror attacks and the horrors inflicted, and their families are in deep mourning, and we join them in their sorrow. But now the entire Jewish community around the world are freshly vulnerable, because those barbarians who took the lives of Jewish civilians in the most unthinkable and inhumane manner are now being celebrated in Western communities globally. Over the weekend, in every corner of the globe, tens of thousands of people joined pro-Palestinian protests. Al-Qaeda flags reportedly seen on the streets during London's protests. And then these were the scenes in Sweden. From Sydney to Melbourne to London to Auckland to Berlin, the size of the crowds were massive. In every protest, it seemed hatred and bile and anti-Semitism. Instead of anger at Hamas, we saw unbridled anger towards Israel. The anti-Semitism within our Western democracies has now been completely exposed. As I say, Jews are freshly vulnerable. There has been no equivalent response in the wake of other recent terror attacks. The September 11 Twin Towers, they were never celebrated by hundreds of thousands or more globally. The ISIS beheadings were roundly condemned, and so too the London bombings in 2007. It would have been unthinkable for tens of thousands of people to take to the streets in every major city in the wake of these terror attacks and either celebrate the atrocities or side with those that committed them. And yet that's what we've seen in the wake of Hamas's brutality in Israel. And a warning, a lot of the content that we're about to talk about is highly distressing. But we've sadly seen solidarity not with Israel, but with Gaza, where the governing body Hamas has burnt and beheaded babies, killed children, and torn babies from pregnant women's stomachs. The terror group Hamas contests this. Their word should carry no weight. Our despicable media praising these protests, these marches as peaceful, are implicitly condoning anti-Semitism. The chants from the river to the sea call for the destruction of Israel and thereby the Jewish people. The fact the protests are occurring in the wake of the terror attacks sends the message that Jews aren't important, our lives don't matter and aren't worth defending. And you have to ask, why aren't all these protesters instead demanding the return of the 210 Jewish hostages, including little babies taken from their beds in early morning bloody raids? Why aren't these lefties and so-called feminists protesting against Hamas's brutal rape of teenage girls? Those attending these protests are not feminists. They're frauds. They're not compassionate humanists. They're frauds. There's a depression that I can tell you has quite clearly set in the Jewish community as we witness as a society the worst and most dangerous anti-Semitism we've seen in half a century. Anti-Semitism that I believe is legitimised by politicians who speak at these rallies, where anti-Semitic signs and slogans are freely waved. Writing in the Australian newspaper about all of this that's unfolded, columnist Henry Ergus wrote this about the protests. He said those Jew haters were out in force, disgracing Sydney's streets, even as Hamas was still butchering its way through southern Israel. If they weren't as vocal in subsequent marches, it was because the organisers specifically asked for the Jew-hating cries to be silenced. In doing so, They simply confirmed what everyone knows, that had the crowd been left to its own devices, the filth would have spewed like excrement from a burst sewer. It's actually heartbreaking that in this country we all love, we're seeing an imported hatred towards the Jewish community that's tolerated by political leaders, the media and law enforcement. The media, here in Australia and internationally, have been appalling. Most media outlets were quick to take Hamas's word as gospel that Israel bombed a hospital. It was a lie. And then they were slow to half-heartedly walk back that claim. How can media organisations seriously think that terrorists who would burn babies wouldn't lie? It was refreshing to see the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett accuse the EBC while he was on air with the BBC of bias and of lacking moral clarity.
And I understand that BBC has taken a side of on the Gazan side because all your questions are only about the Gazan civilians.
That's not
true.
You
haven't asked one question.
That's not
you haven't asked one question about those children. From the very beginning of this interview, you just are asking me about them.
Mr. Bennett,
it seems that you care little about our side. Oh, it is.
Mr. Bennett, I began by talking about the hostages. And what I'm asking you about now is...
No, I'm not talking about the hostages. I'm talking about the babies that were murdered. And you keep on caring only about one side, but that is the BBC way. But let me tell you something. We're here protecting you. We don't need your protection. And if you think there's a balance here between two equal sides, then you are lacking moral clarity. And BBC, I must say, is lacking moral clarity.
He's so right. Now, have you noticed that media outlets and politicians have started calling for a ceasefire? A ceasefire. Now, this is deeply problematic, and let me explain why. A ceasefire may sound compassionate and peace-loving, but think about what people who propose a ceasefire are actually calling for. A ceasefire is accepting that Israel should have no response at all to the slaughter of Jewish men, women and children. Those calling for a ceasefire are again legitimising anti-Semitism. Henry Ergas, in his brilliant column, writes that there will, no doubt, be even louder calls from Hamas's supporters for an immediate ceasefire. Every aggressor, wrote the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, is a lover of peace. Every aggressor is a lover of peace. He wants his aggression to go unopposed. But to prevent aggression, we must fight. And fight Israel will, by whatever means suit it best, until it has achieved its objectives, no matter how many of the Islamists' useful idiots burn Israeli flags and chant anti-Semitic slogans. I suggest you read the whole of that Henry Ergas column in The Australian. It's brilliant, and he's going to be on my program later this week, so tune in every night. Now, I'm beginning to think that there is no longer a line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's impossible now to distinguish when the first begins and the other ends. The concepts are now inseparable. The anti-Semitism of the far right presents as swastikas. The anti-Semitism of the left is expressed against Israel as denying Israel's right to exist. It's a point Noa Tishby made when I spoke with her during her recent Sydney visit.
The one on the left is slightly more hidden. It's slightly more hidden because it's anti-Israel's sentiment, because it's denying the world's single Jewish state's right to exist. It's harder for people to actually understand that this is anti-Semitism, but it is. It's anti-Semitism 2.0.
Now, the situation in the Middle East will feature in talks between Joe Biden and Anthony Albanese, and our Prime Minister has arrived in Washington earlier today, our time.
There's no doubt that the focus of the world is on the unrest in the Middle East following Hamas's invasion and atrocities that were committed in Israel. And we will no doubt be talking about those issues, Australia and the United States are important partners. We will be having discussions.
It'll be interesting to see if Albanese is indeed in lockstep with America in its support of Israel when he has the likes of Ed Husic and Anne Ali and their constituencies on another page. And here was Secretary of State Antony Blinken again today, reiterating America's strong support for Israel.
Israel has not only the right, as we've said, but the obligation to defend itself. We're not in the business of second-guessing what they're doing. We are talking to them on a regular basis about how they do it.
Meanwhile, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has predicted that the war against Hamas would be a tougher fight than the 9-month campaign against ISIS in Mosul.
This may be a bit more difficult because of the underground network of tunnels and the fact that they've had a long time to prepare for a fight. So I think you'll see a fight that's characterized by a lot of IEDs, a lot of booby traps, and just really grinding activity going forward.
Adding to the complexity of this war is still the uncertainty over whether Iran and Lebanon will become directly involved. I mean, Iran is already involved, of course, through its funding of Hamas and Hezbollah. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went north near the border of Lebanon today, and he ordered this warning.
If Hezbollah goes to war with Israel, it will make the mistake of its life. We will cripple it with a force it cannot even imagine, and the consequences for it and the Lebanese state will be devastating.
And there's no question, if Israel has to battle enemies in the north and in the south, it will be increasingly difficult. In Israel, families are now saying farewell to their loved ones as young men and women are called up to defend the Jewish homeland. The hearts of their mothers and fathers, their wives, their husbands are in their chest. These are truly dark times. But the only option now is for Hamas to be destroyed in a war that Israel didn't ask for, didn't want, but has been forced upon it as it fights to bring home its stolen children, babies and families.
Thank you, Madam President, Deputy President. I would like to ask every Australian how they would feel if their children were afraid to go to school. How would they feel if their children were wearing raincoats on a hot day because they didn't want to be identified by their school uniform? How would they feel if their teenagers were attacked in the street because they looked a certain way? This is what has been happening to Jewish kids in Australia since the Hamas terrorist attack on October the 7th. On Friday night in Melbourne, a rally in support of Palestine was held in Caulfield, in the heart of Melbourne's Jewish community. This rally was held across the road from a synagogue during Shabbat. On Saturday, during observations on Remembrance Day ceremonies, similar pro-Palestinian protests were taking place through Sydney. Every Australian has a right to protest peacefully, but holding rallies that raise temperature and spread hate is just so unacceptable, and it is so damn right un-Australian. We are a multicultural country, and it is one of our greatest strengths and something that every Australian should be proud of. But there is a much deeper thing that is happening here, and I want to call it out today, and it's called racism. 2 weeks ago, of all things, Hitler posters started to pop up around Sydney's eastern suburbs. Swastika stickers appeared on walls near synagogues. Attacks on Jewish schools, businesses and people, and they're not just happening here. They're happening all over the world. I had the opportunity to speak to a Jewish mother on Friday who had to explain to her 6-year-old why there was a police van parked out the front of her school in this country. In this country. And by the way, this school already has security. How sad is that in this country? And other Jewish schools around Australia have the same thing. Once again in this country. How shameful. Why do so many of Australian schools, synagogues and museums have to have 24-hour security? Because I'll tell you why. It's called anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism has a long and horrid history that goes back thousands of years. It's the reason that Jews have been persecuted across the centuries. It's the reason that Jewish people fought so hard for a Jewish state. It's also the reason why brutal slaughter of October 7th hit Jewish people so hard. Whole families being murdered in cold blood just because they are Jewish. Hamas are nothing less than criminals and cowards and murderers. They are terrorists. They are terrorists. And they not only say that they want to destroy Israel, that they also say they want to kill all Jews. They are terrorists. They are terrorists. And these attacks seem to be giving anti-Semitic people an excuse to attack and intimidate our Australian Jewish community. The people inciting hate in Caulfield, in Coogee and other places are not heeding this call. But you must. Your community leaders must take control and seek to cool this situation down. That is your responsibility. That is why you are a leader. Start showing it. I call on those leaders to speak to their communities and discourage any action towards hatred. It is not the Australian way. I'd also now like to talk about the calls for a ceasefire. A ceasefire needs arrangements from all sides of conflict. There is no point in whatsoever in calling for a ceasefire when one side is intent upon wiping out the other. Hamas is calling for the destruction of Israel. While the river to the sea calls are being made, a ceasefire cannot take place. Despite this, the Israel Defence Force has been pausing hostilities to allow people to escape Gaza and to allow aid in. These pauses are helpful to those innocents caught in the crossfire. We are in a war, and unfortunately the innocents always pay the price. So you armchair critics calling for political solutions to an active conflict, I suggest you start paying a little bit more attention to the actions of Hamas. They are terrorists, and you cannot negotiate with terrorists. We do not have the picture in front of us that the Israel Defence Force has in front of it, especially how and where Hamas are using innocent civilians as human shields, launching rockets from schools, from mosques and hospitals, and how they're storing weapons inside critical civilian facilities. They should pay attention to what Hamas actions mean in international law, and especially Article 19 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And while they are at it, they should have a look at what is taking place in Pakistan. Right now, Pakistan is arresting and deporting more than 1 million Afghan refugees. Afghans who fled the war and headed to Pakistan for safe harbour have been told they are no longer welcome there. They are being forced to leave while their homes are being bulldozed in front of them. Afghan women and children are being forced back into the arms of the Taliban terrorists. Back to the men of the Taliban who don't allow Afghan girls to go to school, don't allow women to work, and Taliban terrorists who kidnap Afghan girls, raping them and forcing them into marriage. Taliban terrorists who beheaded journalists and Western soldiers and then put it onto the internet for all of us to see. The same thing is happening in Lebanon with Syrian refugees that have been terrorised and murdered by ISIS. Human Rights Watch has reported that deportations of Syrian refugees from Lebanon this year have been the most severe yet. Police raids, arrests and deportations of people seeking refuge from war. Where are the armchair critics on that? Where are you? You've gone in silence. Because you are not calling out these terrorist groups. You are not calling out Hamas, the Taliban and ISIS. They're all the same. They're terrorists. They're murderers. Why aren't these actions being called out like those against Israel defending itself? The Israel Defence Force is one of the most scrutinised militaries in the world, and I am confident that if the Israel Defence Force does anything wrong, it will be held to account. There is no doubt about that. I want you armchair critics in Australia to know this. You are part of the problem. You are part of the problem that is going on out in our streets. Have a good think about that and have a good look at yourselves in the mirror tonight. Because seriously, I've had a gutful of you. And there is way too many of you critics out there. You know what? If you've got so much to say, I say this to you. We are absolutely screaming for people join our Defence Forces, feel free to go and sign up and do something that is useful with your life, once and for all.
Thank you, Senator Lambie.
Well, back to one of our top stories now. That's a Western Sydney business which is facing scrutiny this morning after refusing to lease a jumping castle to a Jewish high school and later posting about it on social media. Joining us live now is the President of the Australian Jewish Association, Dr. David Adler. Doctor, good to see you. Thanks for your time this morning. I mean, it's just ridiculous where all this is at the moment. First of all, just to give us your reaction to it.
Well, look, this is blatant anti-Semitism and it's crazy stuff. Australian children in Sydney have no role in any conflict overseas, and you know it's out of hand. We do actually have laws, both at state and federal level, against discrimination on the basis of ethnicity or race or religion, and we will be recommending to the school that they do explore those legal options. You can't let this thing go unchecked.
No, that's right. I mean, there should be repercussions for the owner, I would have thought. I mean, this is stirring up laws. It was only yesterday that we were only talking about strengthening the hate laws in the state of New South Wales. Chris Minns was already looking into that, so it's quite timely, isn't it? A test for the Premier, perhaps.
It is, and look, the Premier has been pretty good on this subject, but we haven't seen adequate enforcement, and there does need to be enforcement. We have seen in the last few weeks dozens of significant threats directed towards members of the Jewish community or Jewish facilities. We've seen some violence on the streets. There's been a couple of arrests. And I want to make the plea to everyone. Look, occasionally conflicts break out around the world, and whatever you think of the politics, there is no reason to attack, honest, law-abiding people in Australia because of their political views. We have another conflict running. Everyone knows that Russia has invaded Ukraine. We don't see Russian people being attacked and discriminated against, and nor should we. And equally, we don't want to see any anti-Semitism, but it is out of control at the moment, and people need to condemn it. We can't do this battle alone.
You just worry, and I know this has been said by a few folks, worrying about where this is heading. There could well be something worse down the track that happens. Have you? I think you just referred to this, Doctor, but have you spoken to the school?
We haven't yet, because we broke this story after school hours yesterday, and it's still before school hours today. But we'll be contacting them. We've had a quick look at both the New South Wales and federal legislation. There's an Anti-Discrimination Act in New South Wales. There's a Racial Discrimination Act federally, and we think the school's lawyers should initiate action under both those jurisdictions.
Okay, Dr. David Adler, thanks for your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
And let's bring now our weekly Tuesday panel, Sky News hosts Paul Murray and Liz Storer. Welcome to you both. Hello. Now, let's start with what I spoke about in my editorial tonight, the Prime Minister's very clear lack of leadership when it comes to the explosion in anti-Semitism that we're seeing in Australia. I mean, we're seeing this globally. We had those horrifying scenes at Dagestan Airport and hotels in Russia, Paul. But in Australia, the community is terrified. There is massive anti-Semitism. He hasn't held a press conference. He hasn't done anything about it.
Yeah, certainly also when I was noticing in your editorial, as always, fascinating to watch, was these 6 former Prime Ministers can't agree on anything, right? Literally cannot agree on anything, but it represents our national leadership from 1996 all the way until literally 2022. They never sign anything. The only time you'll ever get them in the same place is, frankly, at the funeral of a former Prime Minister. The decision that they took is the ultimate way of showing that Albo's in the wrong spot, of showing that Albo has not said the right things, particularly about anti-Semitism and what is happening in the fear in those communities, because clearly Malcolm Turnbull is the author of it. Of course, Wentworth, significant population. He was clear about what that issue was, informed, of course, by not just a worldview, but also Josh Frydenberg about the need for that statement to be made. When asked about it today, as you played the grab, rather than saying completely endorse what they say, pick a couple of lines from the statement and double down, he finds a way around the statement. I don't know why. I honestly don't know why. Now, I know that there's an opinion piece that's in the Sydney Morning Herald today that suggests one of the problems Joe Biden may well have in part of his re-election is that the extreme left of his party does not like his support for Israel and may well sit out the next election, and that would be a significant enough population to potentially deny a re-election for Biden. Is that what Albo's playing with here? But I wouldn't think that that's statistically big enough. Instead, it's a worldview, and it's a worldview that you've been showing he's always had. And while he may change many things on his way to the Lodge, I don't think he's changed his view on this.
Liz, if what Paul suggests is right, if Albanese is putting politics and votes in communities in Western Sydney above what is right, above standing up for anti-Semitism, that's disgusting.
Absolutely. This guy's an utter shill. And we've seen this from our premiers also. All lip service, no strong action. We've had massive marches this weekend, most recently in Sydney, yelling Allahu Akbar, talking about we stand with you, Palestine, no matter what you do. The people saying that, inciting this kind of hatred, they know what happened on the 7th. So when I say I stand with you, Palestine, no matter what you do, you're talking about the rape, the mutilation, the murder, the ripping unborn babies out of their mothers' stomachs. You stand with that? We've yet to see any strong display of action from our premiers or our Prime Minister on this massive, we can't really call it a rise in anti-Semitism because obviously it's been there all along.
Well, but it's now
simmering underneath the surface. Yeah, and it's taken this to see it come to the fore. And absolutely nothing but lip service from our leaders. It's utterly disgusting.
Sorry, Liz, didn't mean to interrupt. I apologise. You never do it to me, so I'll never do it to you. I know the rules around here.
Go ahead, Paul.
Now,
we want to hear you.
The issue, though, is that what's fascinating to see here is, and we've been talking about this a bit at 9 o'clock, right, which is about what is different. So you see today Netanyahu talking about there was no retreat after Pearl Harbor, no retreat after 9/11. And I think what's something worth considering in the conversation, right, and it's not whataboutism and all the rest of it, right, is that Western countries have not been able to win wars the way they used to when there weren't any cameras around. Why? Because the appetite that the media or the wider public has for civilian casualties, it's not there, right?
Well,
so
ISIL was in recent time. The fight against, ISIS in Mosul, that was in recent times. There were mobile phones then. Well, Afghanistan, 46,000, I think, civilians killed.
100%, but I'm saying the early days in 2001 of what happened in Afghanistan was pre-smartphone, right? You've got this scenario and you've got in Hamas people who are weaponising the images of civilian casualties, knowing
that's why
that
they won't let the civilians leave.
Correct.
That's
and
why they
I'm
won't
not sitting
give them
here,
safe
whataboutism, I'm not finding a way. I'm just saying is that what makes, not the task difficult, but what our leaders have to muscle up against is to say, OK, I'm going to maintain the moral clarity that I had when there weren't the cameras there, when there was the sense of right and wrong, because the reality is if they're going to start to sort of move to wherever Twitter goes on any one day, they're going to provide piss-weak statements like the one that Albo did.
But I think the 6 former Prime Ministers got that balance beautifully. They express sorrow, and we all feel sorrow. There is no one who doesn't feel sorrow for any mother who loses her children, no matter what their nationality or background. They got that right by saying this is Hamas doing it. This is Hamas who sparked this war, who stopped their own civilians from leaving, who used them as human shields. I mean, they literally put their operations under major hospitals.
Well, and if the left wants to create a sense of pressure in that area, where's the conversation about Egypt? Where's the conversation about Egypt opening the southern gate?
The 19 Arab countries surrounding it, the 52 majority Muslim countries won't take a single Gazan. What's going on here? Why aren't they directing their eye where it belongs? You mentioned Dagestan. At least in Russia, they saw 80 arrests. Now, if you look at the lynch mob that ran through that airport, their intention was very clear. I think we would have seen another October 7th right there and then, had those people disembarked from the plane. But Russia took some action. We haven't seen a single arrest that we're made aware of. No show of action, nothing but lip service. It's got to stop, because what that does is tell people of that persuasion it's okay. You won't even get a slap on the wrist.
We still haven't found the organisers of the Opera House thing.
Yeah.
You know,
I don't believe that for a second.
And the police were there and they just didn't do it.
They have.
No, I'm saying, but remember, the organisers of that initial protest put themselves up for media appearances the following day, all right? Which meant those people owned it as the organisers, which meant they could have been fined $22,000. They haven't been. Not once.
Yeah.
And you notice as well that there's no conversation on that leadership of those protests. It turns around and says, well, anyone who says anything terrible, go away. Well, what about the signs? Okay? They have to police that behaviour as well.
Exactly.
But also, we all now know that the sentiment behind those protests is purely anti-Semitic. And it's been such a shock to see that this hatred of me, my community, Josh Frydenberg, Mark Dreyfus, business leaders, is among us. Like, don't you think that has been just such a shock to see that?
Well, again, I mean, when we go back to the last time Australia had to consciously deal with what's happening in the Middle East, we're going back the best part of 20 years, all right? The migrant mix is a lot different than where we were 20 years ago, but also the penchant for the police service to not offend as opposed to crack down and say, no, the joy of this country is come from anywhere, have any connection anywhere from any faith. But in this country, we don't go after people for who they are.
Well, it's on our government, because they have imported by the masses people who don't share our values. Clearly, that's what we're seeing play out in our streets.
All right, we'll see you 9 o'clock tonight, Paul, and you at 10 o'clock. Thank you both so much.
Love you,
Shari.